Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll learn about database recovery using deferred and immediate update. So first, let us learn some of the basic concepts associated with database recovery. First one is database recovery. What is the meaning of database recovery? So database recovery basically deals with techniques which can be used for recovery of the database from failures. So database recovery from transaction failures usually means that the database is restored. The database is restored to the most recent consistent state just before the time of the failure. So database is restored to the most recent consistent state just before the time of the failure. Okay, so database recovery techniques usually deals with how to restore the database to the most recent consistent state it was before the time of the failure. So how will the DBMS know what was the state of the database before the time of the failure? So for this, the DBMS maintains something called as the system log. Okay, so what is this system log? System log is nothing but a log file which is maintained by the DBMS to recover from failures. System maintains a log to recover from failures. So this log will keep track of all the transaction operations which affects the values of database items and any other transaction information which is needed for recovery from failures. All such information will be stored in the log. So this will keeps track of all transaction operations. Keeps track of all transaction operations affecting the values of data items. All transaction operations affecting the values of data items. Now this system log is a sequential append-only file. It is a append-only file which is usually kept on the disk. So that means it will not be affected by any type of failure other than disk failure or catastrophic failure. Okay, so that is about system log. Whenever any transaction operation updates the data item, is it going to be updated on the system log which resides on the disk? The answer is no. It is going to be updated in something called as log buffer. Okay, so what is this log buffer? Log buffer is a buffer which resides in the main memory. So log buffer is mainly a main memory buffer which holds the last part of the log file. So log entries will be first added to this main memory buffer called as the log buffer. Whenever the log buffer is filled, the log buffer contents will be appended to the end of the log file on the disk. It will be appended to end of the log file on the disk. Okay, so in this log buffer entry, there are going to be two types of log entries. We are going to have two types of log entry information associated with the write command. We are going to have two types of log entry information which is going to be included for every write operation done by a transaction, which is nothing but the undo type log entry and the redo type log entry. Undo type log entry and the redo type log entry. So this undo type log entry is nothing but it includes the old value of the data item. Undo type log entry includes the old value of the data item and it's going to be used for the undo operation. Redo type log entry is going to contain it is going to include the new value of the data item and it is going to be used for the redo operation. Okay, so this is two main types of log entry info which is going to be included for every write operation. And then you'll encounter a terminology called as commit transaction, committing of a transaction. What is the meaning of this commit is, commit indicates the successful completion of a transaction, successful end of a transaction. That means there may be many instructions within a transaction, many operations. All the operations have been completed successfully, and the actions of those operations are successfully recorded in the log entry. Okay, so then only it is called as a successful end of the transaction, and the changes which is executed by the transaction is safely committed to the database, and then it will not be undone. So that is the meaning of commit transaction. The other one is undo operation. What is the meaning of this undo operation is, now undo, whenever a transaction has ended unsuccessfully, okay, transaction ends unsuccessfully, whenever a transaction ends unsuccessfully, any changes which the transaction has applied to the database on the disk has to be undone, right? Transaction is not yet committed, transaction has failed. That means if it has modified the values of data items in the database, then all such changes made to the data items in the database on the disk has to be undone. So this is called as undo operation. So undo is basically done to restore the old values of data items. Undo operation basically restores the old values of data items. Old values of data items. The second operation is called as the redo operation. What we do in this redo operation is, so what is redo? The new updated data item values. The new updated data item values are updated on the database which resides on the disk, or updated in the database on the disk. This is called as redo operation. This will happen if the transaction is committed, but the updated values of data items of the which was modified by the transaction is not yet updated in the database on the disk. Then we have to do a redo operation. So now coming to a topic of database recovery, there are two main techniques for database recovery. One is deferred update, and the other one is immediate update. So first we will see about what is deferred update. So before seeing about deferred update, I told you this is the topic of database recovery, and database recovery is needed in the case of failures. What is the meaning of failures? Failures may be generally classified as transaction failures, system failures, or it can be media failures. So failures can be due to a variety of reasons. So it can be due to a computer failure, it can be due to a transaction error, it can be due to an exception condition which is detected by the transaction. Say for example, transaction is doing a division by zero operation or something like that. Or it can be due to a disk failure or a disk read-write head crash, or it can be due to any physical problems or catastrophes like floods, earthquakes, etc. So failure can be due to a variety of reasons. Now coming to a topic of deferred update. The deferred update means you postpone updates to the database until the transaction reaches its commit point. Okay, until the transaction reaches its commit point. Previously, I told you there are two types of operations, undo and redo. So do we need an undo operation here? When do we need an undo? If the transaction is going to change the values of the data items in the database before reaching its commit point, and later if the transaction fails, then an undo operation is required. But in deferred update, the transaction itself is not going to make any changes to the data items in the database until it reaches its commit point. So in deferred update, undo operation is not required at all. Deferred update, there is no such thing like transaction will not be able to do changes before its commit point, and so an undo operation is not required at all. So for this reason, Deferred update is also called as no undo redo recovery. No undo redo recovery. So do we need a redo operation? Only redo type log entries are needed in the log. Okay, so if the transaction has reached its commit point, and after that if there is a system crash, then the values which are updated by the committed transaction has to be updated in the database also. For that we need a redo operation. So that is why it is also called as no undo redo recovery. So you will understand that clearly with this example. You can see this is a portion of the system log at the point of system crash. Okay. So first is start, and these are all the log entries. So first entry is start transaction comma T1. That means T1 transaction T1 has started. Next log entry is write item, which is the action. So T1 has started a write operation, and D is the data item name, and 20 is the updated value of the data item. One thing to remember is there is no undo operation in the deferred update technique. So due to that reason, the log entry will maintain only the new values of the data item. If undo operation is there in the technique, then the log entry will maintain both the old value as well as the new value of the data item. But here we don't need the old value at all, because an undo is not going to be done in the deferred update technique. So only the new values, updated values of data items will be stored in the log entry. And so here 20 means the updated value of data item D, and it is updated by the transaction T1 by the write item operation. And then commit comma T1, which means this is a log entry which shows that transaction T1 has reached its commit point. Okay. And then you have another log entry which says transaction T2 has initiated a write operation and it has updated the value of data item B to 12. Similarly, transaction T3 has started and it has updated the value of data item A to 30. But note that transactions T2 and T3 have not yet reached their commit points, but then there is a system crash. So you have three transactions where transaction T1 has been committed, has reached its commit point. Transaction T2 and T3 have not reached their commit points, and now there is a system crash. So when we follow the deferred update technique, what will happen is the DBMS will check if there is a committed transaction. So if the transaction has failed before reaching its commit point, then there is no possibility of these transactions T2 and T3 to change the values of data items in the database on the disk. Right? So there's no need for any undo operation. So what will happen? These transactions T2 and T3 will be simply ignored. They will be cancelled and they have to be resubmitted. What will happen to the transactions which have reached their commit point at the time of system crash? Transaction T1 has reached its commit point. It means the values which are updated by such committed transactions, the updated values of data items has to be written and updated on the database on the disk. So the updated value of data item D is 20. This will be updated in the database on the disk also. Okay, this is the deferred update technique. So the basic technique is you don't update the database until the transaction reaches its commit point. Until the transaction reaches its commit point, the updates will be recorded only in the log and in the cache buffers. And after the transaction reaches its commit point, the updates will be recorded in the database. This is the basic concept. And whenever there is a system crash, the system will check if the transaction has reached its commit point. If the transaction has reached its commit point, then the updated values of the data items which has been modified by such transactions will be updated in the database on the disk by a redo operation. Okay. And in case if the transaction is not committed, say here you have T2 and T3, they are not committed. So in that case, they will be simply ignored, they will be cancelled, and such transactions have to be resubmitted. Deferred update technique, you're going to have two lists of transactions. You're going to have two lists of transactions. The first is the set of committed transactions, and the second is the set of active non-committed transactions. Okay, so whenever there is a system crash, you check the transactions which are active and not committed or effectively cancelled, and it has to be resubmitted. Whenever there is a system crash, the active non-committed transactions have to be cancelled and they have to be resubmitted. And whenever there is a system crash, for all the set of committed transactions, you have to perform the redo operation. The values of all the data items which have been updated by such committed transactions have to be updated in the database on the disk also. Okay, so basically for committed transactions, a redo operation is being done. So what is the meaning of a redo operation? The meaning of redo operation is check the log entry of that transaction. Okay, and then check the modified value of data item. Check the modified new value of the data item which has been updated by check the modified new value of the data item which has been updated by that particular transaction, by that particular committed transaction, and then you set the value of the item X in the database to the new value. Set the value of the data item to its new value in the database. It's all about the deferred update technique. The next type of database recovery is the database recovery using immediate update. So in this recovery technique based on immediate update, that whenever the transaction performs a write operation and whenever it updates a data item value in the database, it need not wait for the transaction to reach its commit point. Okay, it can update the database on the disk immediately. So that is the concept of immediate update. The basic concept is no need for the transaction to wait to reach the commit point. The database can be updated immediately. The database can be updated immediately. Okay, so that is immediate update. So that means whenever a transaction performs a write operation, the database on the disk will be updated immediately. It will not wait for itself to reach its commit point. So when I say database can be updated immediately, it doesn't mean whenever a transaction updates the value of a data item, it is going to immediately update the data item in the database. Okay, some updates can be applied before the transaction commits, or all of the updates can be done before the transaction commits. Some updates can be applied to the database before the transaction commits, or all updates to the data items can be updated on the database before the transaction commits. Both variations are possible. Both will be coming under immediate update. Immediate update means transaction is not going to wait till it reaches its commit point. It is going to immediately update the database on the disk as soon as it updates the data item during the transaction. Okay, it can be all the updates, or it can be some updates before the commit point and some updates after the commit point. Both are possible. Okay, so this is the basic concept. It is not going to wait till it reaches its commit point. Now let's talk about what will happen whenever there is a system crash. How is recovery going to be done? Whenever there is a system crash, you are going to have two sets of transactions in the system. One is the set of committed transactions and the other is the set of uncommitted transactions, right? You are going to have a set of active uncommitted transactions and the other one is a set of committed transactions. Now in this immediate update technique, both these transactions could have modified the data items in the database on the disk because that is the technique. So what will happen if there is a system crash and you have a transaction which has committed? Okay, then there is a possibility this committed transaction would have modified the database on the disk, or it would have not modified also. But since it is a committed transaction, the updated value of the data item has to be written to the database on the disk. Okay, so a redo operation has to be done. Whenever there is a committed transaction, in the case of this immediate update technique, a redo operation has to be done for the committed transactions from the log. So what is the meaning of redo? The updated new values of the data items has to be taken, has to be fetched from the log, and they have to be updated in the database on the disk. The modified new values of data items has to be updated or loaded in the database on the disk. What about the uncommitted transactions? They would have also caused some damage to the database on the disk, because even though they are uncommitted, since it is immediate update, they would have updated the data items in the database on the disk, and later the transaction would have failed, right? So in that case, they have modified the values of data items, and you have to restore those data item values to their old values. So that means an undo operation has to be done for uncommitted transactions. What is the meaning of undo? You have to restore the data item values to their old values. You have to restore the old values of data items in the database. So, but this uncommitted transaction would have modified the values of data items in the database itself. So from where will I get the old values of data items? For this, in the log entry, recall that in the deferred update technique, the log entry is going to contain only the new values of data items. But in the immediate update, since you are going to have both undo as well as a redo operation, you may have both undo and redo operations. The log entry is going to store both the old values of data items as well as the new values of data items. Whenever an undo operation is required, then the old values of data items will be fetched from the log entry, and then it will be restored in the database on the disk. Okay, so that is about how recovery will be done in the case of an immediate update. So what is the meaning of undo? Undoing a write operation of a transaction means that you will be examining the log entry of the transaction, and you will be setting the value of the item X in the database to its old value. Whichever transaction has updated the value of a data item X, all such data item values will be restored to their old values. That is the meaning of undo operation. If a transaction is committed, then you will be updating the new value of the data item in the database on the disk. So you can see that with an example. So here you have three transactions, T1, T2 and T3. Transaction T1 has modified the value of data item D to 20. Old value is 10. And new value of data item D is 20, and the transaction T1 has reached its commit point. Transaction T2 has started, and it has modified the value of the data item B to 12. Old value is 5, and the new value of data item B is 12. Transaction T3 has started, and it has performed a write operation, and it has modified the value of data item A to 30. The old value of the data item A is 15, and the new value of the data item A is 30. And then there is a system crash. So now what will happen in the immediate update technique is, there is a possibility of all these transactions T1, T2, T3 would have modified the values of A, B and D in the database. Okay, so what should be done? First, transaction T1. Transaction T1 has reached its commit point before the system crash. So in this case, a redo operation has to be done. What is a redo operation? You will be checking the new value of the data item D, and this has to be updated as the new value of D in the database which resides on the disk. Okay, so the new value of D would be set as 20 in the database on the disk, and that operation is called as redo operation. So for transaction T1, a redo operation will be done. What about transaction T2? Transaction T2 has not reached its commit point before the system crash. So, but transaction T2 would have modified the value of data item B to 12. But I have to restore the value of data item B to its old value, which is 5. Okay. So that means undo operation has to be done for transaction T2, and the old value of data item B, which is 5, will be restored again in the database on the disk. Similarly, transaction T3 has started, and it would have modified the value of data item A to 30. Okay, but then transaction T3 is an uncommitted transaction. That means you have to restore the value of data item A to its old value, which is 15. That means I have to do an undo operation here. So the system will check for the old value of data item A, which is 15, and the value of data item A would be restored to 15 in the database on the disk. So redo operation will be done for transaction T1 and undo operation will be done for transaction T2 and T3. And so that is all about the immediate update technique. So from this we have learned that there are two types of database recovery: immediate update as well as deferred update.